This is going to be a multiple part theory that we talked about last time, showing everybody who uses the SportGait platform and hopefully people who will adopt the SportGait platform how we kind of use it and in a different kind of way beyond what would be considered the traditional sort of baseline screening and leave it until you have a concussion. This week, we're going to talk about fatigue. It's an issue that we deal with constantly with athletes. Everybody's tired. And we're going to go through some cases and hopefully show you that, it's not really saying an athlete is fatigued or tired. It's about decoding it and understanding what exactly that means. Um, and so my objectives are going to be the same as they were last week. I'm going to try to reframe your understanding of SportGate and the entire platform and how you can use it, not just as a concussion baseline screener or return to play evaluation tool to help your clinical judgment, but use it as a really vital performance and injury risk tool. How is my athlete performing? Can I optimize their performance? Can I optimize their recovery? Is there something lurking back here in the data that could potentially be a season-ending injury or a game or two missed um, because of something we could prevent? At the end, I'd like to give you some actionable intelligence, some stuff you can use just by simply looking at the report without having to do anything really special, and then hopefully get you excited for talks like this, which is the kind of next level of how to use SportGate. I'm just going to take 2 or 3 minutes and just recap everything we talked about last week, just so if we have any new people that's joined in, or we went over a lot of stuff last week, so just make sure we all have a really good foundation for the jump off point when we start talking about fatigue. Gait isn't just how someone walks; it's the movement, which is the change of static posture into propulsion, and the brain. How those two things work together is gait. And the brain, muscles, joints, all of those systems, vestibular system, proprioceptive system, everything we're getting from our spinal cord, from our joints, all works together to allow us to move through space, which we call gait. They're not independent of each other. My brain isn't independent of my movement, and my movement is not independent of my brain. And so when we put these things together, we'll show you patterns on how you can find how they work together. Um, I've always said, and I'll probably say this in every one of these lectures, that people always say the eyes are the windows to the soul. I think it's really the gait, and it's really the sixth vital sign, and it's because it's objective, it's measurable and trackable. I can use SportGate every single day if I want to on someone to look for change. It's dynamic. It does change if I do have a result that's different from a baseline or different from something I've done in the previous days. It's real, so I can see the change. It's predictive. It can tell me where a risk factor may be if I'm drifting towards something that is a little bit of gone from a yellow flag to a red flag for me. And it's integrative. It combines a whole host of different from cognitive to movement, and it's something I can also use as a way to design an intervention. In reality, we all work, with athletes, and we know they're really great at performing. Last week we talked about some hamstring issues and predicting that from a baseline. Uh, but as athletes fatigue, as athletes go through their season, as athletes go through practices and games, they compensate. They're really good at being really good at what they do. And that means sometimes picking up bad habits, and I use that term loosely in terms of the way that we move. And the gait and cognitive patterns that we can't really see with our eyes that we can measure with SportGait will show us places where that compensation is either there and compensating, or compensating and beginning to break down. And those show up as things like imbalances, asymmetries, fatigue drift, which we'll talk about today, and a cognitive motor mismatch, which we'll also talk about today. So putting these things together really is a way for us to really find something measurable and actionable in an athlete that will make an impact on where they're going. Again, when we use SportGait for gait measurements, we're talking about power, stride, stability, and symmetry. Review again what those mean. We can go forward. There we go. Power, we're talking about striking force and pushing force. And you can see this is what we'll see on the app or on your desktop, wherever you happen to be looking at the um, data, you'll see the graph at the top, which we talked about last week, and we'll talk about again. And we'll have our bars where the athlete's scoring on the normative data. We have power, we have stride, which is stride time, which is how much time it takes to do the full cycle, how much time we're spending in stance phase, how much time we're spending in swing phase, and how much time we're spending on double stance phase. And all of those are really important pieces of information as we talked about and will talk about. We have stability, which is side to side sway, front to back sway, and support variables, which happens when one foot leaves the ground until the other foot makes contact. So what are we doing while we're in the air? And then we have symmetry, which is looking at power, stride, and stability and putting those things together and saying, are we moving with symmetry? Is left moving with right? Is right moving with left? Are we swaying? Are we not swaying? So you can see, even with that simple sort of gait scan, was 10 steps back and forth, we're collecting a tremendous amount of data. The Connors continuous performance test is a very robust test. The idea is, again, not to hit the X. It's a very powerful cognitive test and how it translates into sports. We talked about last week too, hit reaction time and decision making, omissions, loss of focus. That means drop balls, missed reads. When you commission making, wrong responses, showing some impulsivities where you're going to jump off sides or commit fouls. Hit reaction time, standard deviation, and variability is really stamina. How does mental fatigue play in? And we're going to have poor execution or poor focus towards the end of a game. And preservations is repeating mistakes, and are we bad at task switching? Do we have a reduced ability to adapt? And that will become important, particularly late in games. Can I adapt? Can we shift a formation? Can we change a defensive strategy? All these sort of things happen late in games, and where is our brain during that period of time? How those connect the CPT to gait correlation patterns, we talked about again last week, and how they will show us particular areas of fatigue in the brain will manifest in areas of inefficient gait mechanics. A lot of that has to do with how the brain pathways work, that when we're trying to motivate through an environment or move through an environment, it takes a lot of executive function, a lot of planning, a lot of inhibition, a lot of activation. We're talking about frontal lobe, parietal lobe, prefrontal cortex, visuospatial information coming from the occipital lobes, and how those things integrate together is how we move through space. The interesting thing about the CPT is that it's a measurement of those things. It's telling us about working memory. It's telling us about cognitive stamina. It's telling us about executive function, all of those things that we need to have preserved to produce movement in the world. How we integrate SportGait with that is we do the CPT first, and then we do the gait second, with the idea that when we hit the brain first with the CPT, we are pre-fatiguing all of those executive function things that we need to move. So if I pre-fatigue the control system, the output might be altered. So I'll pick up the changes in gait, or changes in gait may be exaggerated if I can fatigue the brain first. So think of it as being a brain stress test. We preload it, we do the gait test, we're able to pick up things that are showing inefficient connections between the nervous system and the musculoskeletal system. So pairing those two things together is really, really important when you're doing a SportGait. So if you do a CPT one day and do a gait test the next day, you might pick up some findings, but what they mean it is not really very interpretable when you start looking at the system as a whole. All right, so that's our review. Now we'll get into what we're going to talk about today. And today's a little bit more of an esoteric kind of talk on how we're going to use a SportGait scan to look for fatigue. And one of the issues that we know is that fatigue is a really big risk factor for injury. And one of the things that we deal with athletes and thinking about, we don't, the way that's kind of phrased isn't so much managing fatigue and managing load, because we think when we have fatigue we have to change load, but we're going to kind of change that perception a little bit today, and think about how we can look at fatigue, and if I can measure it, I can fix it, is kind of the theme of where I'm going to try to take some of these things today. We all know that fatigue, we have impaired neuromuscular control, so our motor patterns aren't great. We may have training load spikes, which increase risk of soft tissue injury, the biomechanical changes, predictive analysis. These are all things that are happening as as a athlete fatigues, that these little tiny minor changes can add up to a really big injury, which is why we get so concerned about how an athlete is recovering, how tired athletes are. There's tons of literature out there looking at the different types of fatigue that athletes will encounter. And I think that's sort of even though it's really well published and well studied and it's great, I think it's a little misleading because all fatigue, whether it's peripheral fatigue, we're talking about something at the neuromuscular junction or the muscle in effectual ATP production, it all comes back to the brain. Peripheral, cognitive, sensory motor, neuromuscular, psychological fatigue, just being burnt out, and central fatigue, all of those things really come from the brain. And so when we start thinking about fatigue and start thinking of it more of a collective neurological issue than something that happens in a muscle because I've just run 15 kilometers, yeah, I'm tired. But there's a neurological proponent behind that I want to try to drive to today as we go through this. It's all connected to the brain. So fatigue doesn't always jump out at you, and sometimes it's a very subtle kind of thing. And I'm going to show you how we look at fatigue or how I look at fatigue in the SportGait platform. And we're going to go through some of the big picture items that we'll look at, and then I'm going to go through some cases. One of the first things you're going to see is you're going to see a breakdown in gait symmetry. And usually asymmetry is going to increase after a change in direction. So particularly post-turn. After they do the turn, you're really going to, if you're fatigued, that's when your symmetry is going to break down. One leg is going to lag behind. Another leg is going to become stiff. You're going to shorten steps, delayed responses. And this is happening without pain. So these are not necessarily limps or soft tissue injuries. This is a breakdown in that communication between the brain and its ability to control movement. And it particularly happens after we do a CPT because, again, we've pre-fatigued that executive function aspect of the brain. Second thing you're going to see is a vertical power drop. You're not going to be able to get up off the ground. You may see diminished power. You may see diminished striking forces. You may see inconsistency. One of the things that I look for, particularly with power, is variability. When I see a lot of variability, it tells me that I'm having a poor neural control over what's happening in my gait. So we can have a drop in power, but the cadence remains the same. We may have the same sort of pattern of walking, but we have a drop in power, or we may have wide fluctuations in power and wide variances in cadence. The other thing we're going to see is sway, particularly medial lateral, front back, any sort of trunk compensation is going to tell me that I have a central fatigue coming on because our we're going to have some proprioceptive misinformation coming, and our posterior chain, particularly our glutes and core and hamstrings, are responsible for maintaining that balance. And if those become fatigued and are not firing, aren't working, we're going to have sway. So we're starting to lose that communication of where we are in space and time. Shows up as balance issues. The other one that we're going to see, this jumps from gait to cognitive function, is we're going to see some changes in the way that these athletes perform on the CPT, and we're going to see commissions, which are going to be impulsive areas, and we're going to have variability, which is going to tell us that there's a loss of focus. So if you put these things together, think about the brain is slipping and the body is compensating. It's almost a disorientation where the brain isn't able to tell the body exactly where it is, and the body isn't able to tell the brain exactly where it is because the information is getting lost in the static. What I see, and this is sort of from my experience, is that when I'm looking at athlete with we're going to go different types of fatigue here, but in high performing athletes, what I see the most in terms of cognitive testing, where I'm seeing the most amount of change with someone who's fatigued, I'm looking as a variability. So consistency of response across trials. It means the brain's still performing, but it's struggling over time. We're losing some of our cognitive endurance. And then our hit reaction time ISI, which is how I'm able to change my reaction from between stimuli. That tells me if I'm losing the hit reaction time ISI, I'm having a real difficult time processing change. How much time between responses, how fast responses are coming at me, how fast the letter stays on the screen. I can't cope with that. And that's a really great indicator of brain fatigue, cognitive fatigue in athletes. So these two, we'll talk about these in some cases, but those two in particular in the CPT jump out at me a lot when I'm looking at fatigue. So in summary, we have gait issues, we have symmetry issues, we have power issues, we have sway issues. We're going to have post CPT drift, which is we're really going to see on our turns, and then we have our CPT data where we're going to see a lot of cognitive endurance issues, increased variability. So these are the things we're going to look for as we go through all of our athletes' gait. We're looking at power, symmetry, shift, and where we're going with our CPT in terms of reaction time and cognitive reserve. So why take this deep of a dive into looking at an athlete's gait? Um, and that's a really fair question because sometimes I think we just assume after a heavy work week or multiple matches in a week or towards the end of a season, all athletes are tired, and it's part of the job. It's what you have to deal with, and that's true, but how a fatigue occurs or how athletes express fatigue or experience fatigue is different in each individual and may be triggered by different stimuli. So something may be athlete may be fatigued by a physical component of something or a mental component of something. And those two things can show us a different footprint of where fatigue is happening. Some of the misconceptions here on the left side of this table. Fatigue is just soreness or feeling drained. That's not true because if we start to think about what system is breaking down, again, at the surface you feel tired, but as we'll see, there's different systems and different levels of breakdown, and where they happen is where we can start to fix things. Which brings me to the next point: everyone recovers with time off, and that's not true. And we'll talk about that in a minute too. I say that there's time off, no days off. And um, if we take a deep dive into SportGait, which takes you 12 minutes, it's nothing. Athlete can do it at home before they even show up if they're compliant. It allows me to personalize recovery for somebody. And through these three cases I'll show you today, each case required a different intervention to promote recovery. The other thing is, well, they're performing fine. They're playing at a high level. I'm not going to worry about it. Just going to push through. That's true to a point. You may not see it in the performance, but you're going to catch it before it becomes a problem in performance. Not everyone is going to be able to handle a high performance through the course of the season. Just because they're performing fine doesn't mean that something bad couldn't happen. And our idea with using this sort of deep dive is to catch those things, catch the yellow lights, the check engine lights before they become problems, before they could become mental mistakes on the court or become unfortunate soft tissue injuries that could have been prevented. Um, and that fatigue is just noise, that the pattern of fatigue's fingerprint, you know, the pattern of fatigue that we'll see in people is decipherable and it's actionable. So everyone's fatigued, we know that, but which cylinder is misfiring? You know, if you think about running codes on your car, if you work on cars, you know that which cylinder is misfiring? Is it cylinder two, cylinder three, whatever? Each cylinder has a different job to do, and we can find out where we are in that misfiring and fix it. So we're trying to enhance recovery and thereby promote better performance. Am I not moving forward now? Oh, the gremlins are out today. Here we go. All right, so we're going to go into a case. I just wanted to remind you that as we go out to the app or the desktop, we're going to be able to look at results in a couple of different ways. We're going to stay in those top two, looking at PDFs and the results sections. So if you click on those, you get the same sort of information, but at a different level of detail. We're going to go through BKG tracings and CPT details at another time. So one thing I want to reiterate to people is that, and this is something I experience and something I hear a lot from people who use it, is I just did a baseline on someone who's totally normal and I'm getting possible indications, or in this athlete down at the very bottom of the screen, I got a probable indication. What the heck am I supposed to do with that? Some people would say, okay, this is a baseline, and put it in their pocket and move away. Some people may question what that means. These are our check engine lights. When we start seeing possible indications or probable indications, think beyond concussion because this is the idea of SportGait is to be able to investigate or interrogate the connections between the brain and the body. And if you have a concussion, obviously you're going to have a disruption between what's happening in your brain and what's happening in your body. And concussions are going to manifest with gait abnormalities, but we may already have systems not working optimally in our athletes. So we talked about last week when you do a baseline, there may be indicators in there that this is not a concussion, but this is a potential area where I can intervene. And in areas where I have low baselines or scores that fall below the mean, excuse me, those are areas where I like to do interventions. And it may be a quick 5-10 minute um, workout before they hit practice or before they hit the gym that activates the muscles that are not optimally functioning. So don't put these in your pocket and move away. These are the check engine lights. These are the the chances for you to intervene and have a positive impact on an athlete. I've always said this that every opportunity I have to talk with an athlete is a chance for an intervention, and it also builds great relationships and trust. That if I do this in an athlete and I say, "Hey, I found this in your SportGate. Let's add this to your program to get your glutes activated before you go to the gym, before you go to practice." That way, we're trying to optimize what we're doing. So don't ignore these and don't be frustrated. Like, oh, it's always telling me there's an indication. These are chances for you as a healthcare professional to go in and interrogate the athlete and find out what exactly isn't working and how can we make it better. So here's athlete number one. Here's athlete number one that we are going to go through. This is a professional athlete that is was towards the end of a season and was functioning at a very high level of um, very high level of of performance. Yet I really felt that this person was tired. This person was putting up really high values and numbers and working really hard in practice. And I just was worried that the injury was going to happen because this is somebody that I did not want to have miss any time. And another one of my cliche sayings, as the number one attribute you can bring to your team is availability. So the last thing I wanted was lack of availability of this athlete. So we'll take a look at what we saw. Here is our power graph on this person. And unfortunately, on this case, I don't have any previous data. So we can't compare it. The next couple of cases. I do have some comparative data. But this is the bars that you'll see down here in the power profile. Everything is sort of in the midline. All the T scores are sort of in the 50s. So when you look at that, you might think, nothing here really to worry about. Everything's in the 50s. But when we look up here at the power graph, you can see that there's a little bit well, actually, a significant amount of variability of what's going on here with our striking force and pushing force. So if we take it to the next level and think about within those T-scores, we may have a normal value, but that normal value may not be optimal. And if we narrow where our optimal is, we can find a way to come in and look at these gait cycles and find out where things are breaking down, even though we may be in a normal T square window. One of the things I think to think about here too is with athletes is I want to look for change. A 5% change in a function from a previous SportGait test, 5 to 10% is a really big change for a high performing individual, whether they're a professional athlete, high school athlete, someone who's performing at a high level. 5% is a lot. And even though it may be dropping from 60 to 55 or 55 to 50, that is a big change for an athlete. So if we look at the power graph interpretation here on our first athlete, we can see we have low inconsistent output. So we have a weak striking force and a shallow push force. And if you look at this graph, which is telling me that I'm not having a lot of propulsion here. I'm not really moving forward with any force. And then if we look at sort of the middle phase, in that 3 to 6 second part, I'm having these sort of brief bursts of spikes, which is telling me that I'm trying to compensate for something. And that is sort of a neuromuscular instability. And at the very end, we see it sort of flattens out, and then the brain kind of tries to do a couple of more steps to maintain where we are. And this is a classic sign of CNS fatigue. It's cumulative. So as we get towards the end of that gait cycle, around that 7 second mark, we're starting to really get tired. And the brain is trying to say, okay, I've got to keep moving. I have to keep moving. So it's telling us that we have some declining neuromuscular communication and inefficient communication. We're putting effort through, but we don't have any real explosiveness or any power for it. We're sort of going through the motions. The body is just walking, and it's just sort of trying to move from point A to point B. And we're losing coordination and power, particularly post turn. If we look at stride indicators, again, these are all in green. These are 64, 66, 65. Again, I don't have a baseline on this person, so I'm not sure where they would have been previous to this. But if we come and look at the graph itself, we can see there's some variability, step-to-step variability here. It should be nice and tight, and everything should look really good. You can see the tracings out around the median graph here are kind of a bit all over the place. And if we look early on, we have some flattening, that we're having some reduced terminal swing velocity. We're slowing down. It's showing us our posterior chain is not really functioning. We're a little bit tired. As we get to the mid stance, about that 0.5, you can see there's a lot of variability going on here. We're not having full limb recovery. We're compensating for that posterior chain not working. We'll see that in the balance here in a second. Overall, if you look at the whole cycle, we can just see every step is just, it just looks like a spaghetti laid out across the table here. So what we're seeing here is, again, neuromechanical inefficiency. We're having the central nervous fatigue going to be manifest itself in a lot of posterior chain and core issues. And we're having some coordination drift, particularly here in the late cycle. It's a little bit better in the very early, around the 0.1 second. But as we get towards the end of the cycle, where we would expect it to be tired at about 0.9, we're starting to have more variability. And that really it initiates itself at about mid-cycle, about 0.05. If we look at symmetry in this athlete, first thing you can see, these are not tracking very well about mid-cycle. The beginning, we're doing okay in the loading phase. Bilateral limb looks okay. As we get to that 0.45 or 7 second range, we're starting to have some divergence in the curve. And if you think that the right leg is the purple line and the left leg is the kind of pinkish line, we can see here that we have divergence in these two legs, where the left leg is not really doing its job. It's not moving, where the right leg is doing a lot more of the work. It's having to swing more, do more of the propulsion. It's taking over for this left leg at the top that doesn't really want to do its job. And if you look at how the grayed out area is, so we're talking about our normal envelope and where we should be, there's no overlap on those. They sort of are very widespread, which is telling me that the step-to-step precision is not great. And it gets a little, really at that mid-cycle where you would expect it to be is when you're the most unstable. And think of it as being like a top. When you spin a top, it becomes the most unstable as it slows down. And so when you come to that midpoint of the gait cycle is when you're at the most stable, and that's the most unstable. And that's when you're going to see these kind of changes. So we start off kind of early, breakdown happens about mid-cycle, and then our dominant side is taking over because the other side, which is weak, the left side, which is weak, everybody has sort of a dominant side anyway, but there's more compensation on the positive, your right leg or the predominant leg, and a less ability for that left leg to even pick up the slack. So it's falling even further behind. These are really classic patterns for risks for hamstring, calves, and back and core injuries as well. Balance, you can see the balance is 50, 53. We're really not talking about a huge amount of change, but if we look at the balance overhead, again, the graph at the top is looking top down on the athlete. So we're looking down on their head, and that grayed out area is telling us where they're moving during their gait cycle. And what we're seeing here is some core instability. We're getting some wobble, and we have a little bit more of a backwards weighted stance and a little bit more lean towards the left than the right, which we would expect because the left leg is not really doing its job. So we're kind of falling to that side. We're spending, our right leg is going faster than our left leg, so we have that lag. So it's not really doing its job. So as we come off, we're spending more time kind of falling to the left. Um, so we see this lateral and posterior shift in this particular athlete. Why am I not moving forward? There we go. So if we look at the CPT, and this is where this case gets really interesting. Again, this athlete was performing very high, and was nothing was um, obvious about this athlete, other than I just was worried about them being tired and um, thinking preventively, and rather than performance based, because the performance was not degraded in any way. But if we look at what happened with the CPT results, the biggest remember for CPT, the lower the T score, the better performance. We're drifting sort of high, even though we're within that some of these are within that normative value. We're starting to drift high. We're having with the detectability, we're having reduced sensitivity. With hit reaction time, we're slightly slowing down. Even though the hit standard deviation was consistent, was telling me this guy's really trying to focus on this test. The hit reaction time ISI change was normal, but still getting up into the high 40s, early 50 percentile mark. The omissions was enormous. I mean, he was missed response was everywhere. So we're having that tells me we have a lot of fatigue going on here. Variability was not so bad. Preservation is not so bad. But we have the subtle markers being our detectability, showing a decreased discrimination accuracy. We're having drift. Basically, he's not paying attention. And when the hit reaction time is modestly slowed down, um, with the omissions, we're talking about the failure to respond when appropriate. And again, that neuromotor disengagement is the brain zoning out. And we can see that in the gait. We saw that kind of with the power graph where the steps were inconsistent. And then we had some decreased power followed by some increased power followed by a lack of power, where the brain is not really oriented and we're trying to pay attention and we can't. We're kind of zoned out. So we're having a problem with fatigue creeping in, and this is where we're going to have problems late in the week, late in the game, when they're going to zone out and when there are going to be problems. So this, even though this person is performing at a very high performance level, it allowed me to optimize and change some things in the recovery so that I can take care of this neurological fatigue, this cognitive fatigues before it becomes a mistake on the field. Um, Again, when we see this sort of summary in this athlete, the things that we've teased out of just looking at beyond those T scores is we have, increased CPT omissions, low hit reaction time, the brain's beginning to lag, attention starting to slip, timing control becomes mismatched. We're not really sure where we are in time and space. That manifests in our gait with asymmetry, with trunk sway, decreased power push off, and we saw inconsistency in the power push off. And we had this left to right drift because that left leg, which is not the dominant leg, is already starting to decompensate even more. And the right leg, which is our dominant leg, is starting to take on more and more work. So if you can't correct what you can't see. And so now that I have this information as athlete, we designed, I couldn't decrease the load, but what we did is we really made sure we took care, as we'll talk about at the end, some of the key things to recover for him, particularly surrounding his sleep, and him, making sure he got not just quantity of sleep, but quality of sleep. And so we were able to catch this fatigue before it became something more nefarious that ended up in the training room. Athlete number two, this is, again, you see these sort of scores on your PDF report. And I have check engine lights here. And if you noticed a pattern here already, just by looking at the PDF reports, fatigue is showing up here as a possible indication in a cognitive. And out of this one's a very kind of interesting case. We have 5 indicators out of this. And then symmetry. So cognitive and symmetry, cognitive and symmetry, cognitive and symmetry seem to be coming up whenever we start talking about fatigue. So when you pull out some cases to take a look at, try to find this pattern. Athlete number two was I do have some before and after um, on this athlete, but this was an athlete that had some time off, and during that time off, I was fairly convinced that they were not going to be compliant with instructions that were given to them during their time off in terms of the at-home workout, diet regimes, sleep hygiene, hydration. They were probably going to be staying out late, doing all the things that you would unfortunately expect a young person to do, but at the same point in time, would hope that professional would be make better, or any athlete at an elite level would make better decisions off the field. And you can see here, just by looking at this, we have a lot of stuff going on in this power tracing. We have, first of all, it's erratic. We have a lot of variability. You can just look at that and say it's really variable. There's something not right here. And that reflects an unstable motor recruitment. The CNS is really struggling to produce anything. The rhythm is off. That this drop off we have after about 7 seconds as we get to the end, we have this flattening where we lose power, where all of a sudden the brain is saying, "Oh, wait a second, I'm moving. I have to wake up. I have to make some steps." So that's why we have that flattening around the 9.2 with these two spikes. Is the brain is turned back on again after being shut off from about 8 seconds to 9.6 seconds. Now all of a sudden it turns back on again. So I got it, which is why it's spiky. It's trying to move quick and catch up to where it is because it forgot what it was doing. And this is how really classic CNS fatigue again, after turn, variability, and then trying to recover at the end is with this athlete. Again, erratic timing's off. And again, this last point here is it's not because there's a weakness. This person had basically done nothing for a week. So I'm not worried about their body being stressed out, but by doing nothing physically and not doing the workouts, what they were doing at night, what they were doing with their nutrition, what they were doing with their hydration, that's what we're seeing right here. We're seeing someone who's not physically fatigued, but cognitively fatigued, and it's showing up here as alterations in their power production. Same thing with their stride. This is a very asymmetric looking slide of their stride. The trajectory arc is asymmetric, uneven. We're looking at, again, a unilateral propulsion dominance because we're relying on one leg where the other leg is dropping off. We're having, because this is the interesting thing here in the mid stride, around the 0.5 seconds to 0.7 seconds is where we really start to disintegrate. So if you look at the beginning of the graph, it's not so bad. And then after that 0.5 seconds, it just disintegrates because the brain is just not paying attention to where it is. It's lost its focus. That put in here, we're losing focus. We have our posterior chain is not doing what it's supposed to be doing and keeping us where we need to be. And some of that could be an energy system imbalance too. So I put something in here about mitochondrial fatigue, which if we're not having good hydration, not having good nutrition, our mitochondria become stressed. We're not able to get ATP produced. Our ATPase enzyme is not optimally activating, which can also manifest itself as some of these physical issues too. So it's more of a nutritional aspect to this as well. So this is out of rhythm, off balance, and we have a full system level of disintegration. This is after just a week of deconditioning, or just not doing what they were supposed to be doing. Balance, you can see here, this is, I think, a really interesting balance graph. Again, looking down the top of the head of the athlete, this athlete is falling frontwards and drifting to the left. And we can see that if we think of back to the power graph, where we have that lack of rhythm, those kind of shallow steps, and then all of a sudden flattening and then a catch up. The brain doesn't know where it is. And some of this may be some vestibular proprioception fatigue, where We've got this sort of frontward fall and trying to catch itself, which we'll see with those steps, which may be those rapid steps at the end, is the brain realizing, wait a second, I'm kind of going too far forward here, and tries to catch up with a couple of quick, powerful steps to maintain their balance. So that part of that anterior displacement is really telling me that the posterior chain is disengaged, and that the brain is just not really telling me, where exactly it needs to be. Um, um, and you can see the clinical interpretation looking at exactly what we just talked about. We have, um, recovery gaps here, probably proprioceptive, vestibular, leftward bias, the medial lateral sway because we have underpowering of that left leg, compensation of that left leg, and we're just again we're not knowing where we are. We're not paying attention, and we're not paying attention um, with our executive function, and we're not integrating the information that's coming from our cortical spinal tracts or our spinal cortical tracts that are telling us where we are in space. So we're not losing balance so much as you're going to see this person walk like, a drunken sailor, but we're going to be able to see it in this, where they're not this. It's going to be subtle enough where I'm not going to see it. This person maybe walk by me and not notice it, but it's because the balance isn't lost. It's just not efficient, and that's what we're trying to do with our athletes, is to have them move with the best efficiency as possible. So we're compensating for that by this inconsistency and increased variability of where we are in space. The symmetry starts off okay, and then again, mid-cycle, we have this drift where the left leg kind of lagging behind, moving slow, the right leg's taking over all the work, asymmetric loading with that right-sided dominance. And if we go into that late phase, we have this sort of stride um, loss of control that is in what we see in the fatigued athlete, where the instability in that late cycle again is where we're gonna find there's a problem. Is it the balance just isn't off, right? Where we saw in the balance, it's not coordinated, and it may not be something you're going to pick up with your naked eye. So summary for this athlete: power graph, we had inconsistent force peaks, and we had some flattening followed by some quick steps at the end, trying to figure out where I am in space. Stride graph is flat, so we've lost our gait rhythm and our neuromuscular control. Um, Balance graph, we had sort of a widened area of where they're going. We had some compensation both to the left side and frontwards, which really is when you see somebody kind of falling forward like that. Lots of extremes falling backwards. We're proprioception issues. We're not where we are in space. We're not paying attention. And the symmetry graph um, is we're shifting all of our load to that dominant limb, because not only is our non-dominant limb non-dominant and an area of potential weakness anyway, now it's even weaker because we've fatigued it. So we're putting a lot of load onto that right leg, which also that doesn't just increase the injury risk for that right leg, it also increases the injury risk for that left leg because now it's not efficient at all. That, those are subtle. We may have still be within some of our T ranges on here. This is where stuff got really interesting with this athlete. It was the CPT scores. And I do have a baseline on this athlete, which is really helpful for us for this part of the exercise. And I want you to think about primary and secondary indicators when we are looking through the lens of a concussion or a head injury. Primary indicators are things that are very tightly correlated with what we're going to see with people who may have a concussion. Secondary indicators, sort of supportive stuff. The more secondary indicators I have in a head injury, the more, even though I have a clinical suspicion to begin with, the more supportive and beneficial it becomes for me and telling me kind of targeting what I need to do. With a generally screening athlete, I don't think of them as primary and secondary indicators. I think of primary indicators as being like the big functions of the brain, but the secondary indicators are kind of where a lot of secret stuff is hiding. We're going to see a lot of things kind of whispering to us that something isn't right here. So if we go through this particular CPT on athlete 2, we'll see that the hit reaction time is above baseline. Omissions is just below baseline, and the hit reaction time standard deviation is way low. I will say that for this athlete, at all of these, we were already operating. This is this is the exam we did for this athlete at this point in time. A previous exam had us above baselines for all of these. So we have a major change. Not only changing from baseline, we've changed from where we've improved. Look at the secondary indicators. Look at that. It's just smoked. Everything is really high. So there's a high level of cognitive fatigue going on here in this athlete. That is a serious warning sign that you may not have picked up. Maybe somebody walks in after having some time off, and you think they're great, send them out to the pitch. The next thing they come off the court or the field or wherever, and they're hurt. And we don't know what they did on their time off. They don't know what they did on their weekend. You don't know what they did when they were away from the facility, because sometimes we don't have great control of that. Here was somebody I suspected wasn't going to be one of our more compliant athletes, and this is what we saw. Um, um, so if we take from that table and just kind of tell us, particularly where we had severe impairments, which are detectability. So um, cognitive overload, commissions, elevated impulsivity is going to have poor control. Um, the preservations was the most severe impairment. And here we have high executive function is just not there. The frontal lobe is just not working. And that's going to manifest itself in a lot of different ways. And we have, variability. Again, anytime I see variability, I'm thinking a cognitive basis for what's going on. And that was the picture of this athlete's CPT. So what I'm really seeing here as a fatigue cognitive profile that is, you know, really showing me executive function strain, poor cognitive resilience, and a dysregulated control. It's manifesting as these gait problems that are subtly showing up, that are really a train wreck waiting to happen. So the combination of this gait data and what I'm seeing in the CPT and the confessions that I didn't sleep, I didn't train, I didn't have any recovery days, I may have done some things I probably shouldn't have done, allows me to set up a protocol that will get this person back to where they need to be. And that will involve some hydration, nutrition, sleep, and those sort of things. So if we think about this athlete in a holistic kind of thing, everything that was going on with this athlete's all in the head. The gait, again, we had changes in gait, weren't huge, wild deviations from normal, but were changed, were variable enough that were concerning. And you combine that with what we're finding in our CPT, we have increased emissions, we have a symmetry breakdown. If we have hit reaction time ISI changes where we're struggling to maintain pacing and rhythm, we're going to have irregular stride arcs. Hit reaction time goes up, we have a power drop, decreased detectability, we have balance spread increase. So our map, if we think about that balance graph, it gets wider. So we're taking up more space around us. Balance, thinking about 2 to 4 centimeters in each direction. When you move, we're talking about becoming wider than that. And the variability being borderline is where we're going to see the micro areas accumulating, where we're going to see step-to-step fluctuations like we saw in the power graph. Athlete 3, this is a before, and I was lucky enough for this person to have a tracing maybe 3 weeks before, and due to a host of things that involve life, this individual went over 24 hours, close to 36 hours without sleep. And this is a sort of we think about travel and how we deal with long distances, especially in the United States, professional sports, where we have to cross the country in time zones, long flights, delays, weather delays, all these things that happen when you try to travel manifest in your athletes as fatigue. And so we have about a month before or so is the top graph of the power of this individual. And then we have the still sleep deprived, because I used it as science fair. And again, anybody who comes into my house gets a SportGait. And if I find out that you have something that could be interesting to look at, I'm going to give you a SportGait. Finding out they've been almost 36 hours without sleep, I say, hey, guess what we're going to do? We're going to do a SportGait. And you can see the difference here on the bottom that it's, we've got one thing I should tell you about this, the top graph is not entirely normal, obviously. Um, it's better than where we had tracking with this particular athlete because we have some things that we're working on with this athlete. One thing in particular, there's a previous ACL injury um, that we're dealing with, trying to make sure that we have symmetry and our balance, power, stride with this previous historical ACL injury. So we're seeing some of that manifest at the top. But you can also see it here where I think some of these peaks and lows, it looks almost patterned, where I think we're really starting to see how that leg with the ACL just was not generating the things that it needed to do. And then after we get about 7.4 seconds into it, the gig just stops. I mean, he's just done. He is tired. It's over. I can't walk anymore. And you can see that very dramatically in these two graphs. I don't know, I need to go through all of the uh, metrics that are in here, but we have decreased explosive output, loss of coordination and pacing. We know we have neuromuscular endurance is degraded because we have sleep loss. And look at what happens at the back end of that gait. It's trying to compensate. We can see that now we're at the very beginning. This is a really interesting compensation pattern where I have, it looks very rhythm, lack of not a lot of variability. But if you look at the top graph, it's very different than what's going on here. And something's trying to really focus and compensate as we begin to walk by this. Um, I think that's a really interesting graph overall for power degradation towards the end, where I'm done. I want to go to bed. We see the same thing in the stride, and if this is the same time with the strides, this is actually really nice. And I know we haven't seen, again, there's no such thing as a normal gait, but we can have optimal gaits, and this is pretty optimal. We don't have a lot of deviation here between the right and left legs. And you can see now when we think about those other athletes see how the grayed out areas sort of overlap with athlete 1 and 2 that we saw. Those windows were wider. You can see down here at the bottom, those windows become wider. That's variability. So the top graph is really nice. We have really pretty tight symmetry between the right and left leg. We still have a little bit of decreased output from that left leg. Again, something we're working really hard on to make sure that that left leg doesn't become a weak leg because of that historical ACL injury. But when we get tired, look what happens. The right leg kind of stays the same here a little bit. We don't have a whole lot of change, but look what happens to that left leg. It sort of poops out. I'm done. I'm over. I'm over this. I'm just gonna give up on you. And I think we see that in the power graph, where that decreased power is our left leg not really wanting to do anything because we're tired. And if we compare the two of them, we have an increase in asymmetry. So we're neuromuscular, not very coordinated. We're having that fatigue induced motor control drift. We have a disrupted bilateral gait control and poor midline stabilization with this. We can see here at that almost at 0.6. And we have a poor ability for us to compensate um, with our movement as we begin to continue to move down through our 10 steps. So these are pretty significant differences in these two legs. Again, these are maybe a month apart. And the only thing that had changed in between here was the lack of sleep with this particular athlete. The next one I think is really interesting, the balance graph. This is about a month before again. We had a nice tight circle around this individual where there's not a lot of wobble. We do have some left deviation, but it's a very sharp, not really diffuse. Again, that's because we have this left ACL. That's a historic injury that we're trying to keep track of and make sure that we get it back towards the end of the bullseye. And look at this with lack of sleep. It's all over the place. Again, we have this really front and back wobble and a lot of wobble to the left. So we have increased postural sway. We have a directional bias. And whenever you have a directional bias, like we've seen with the other cases, we start thinking about vestibular and proprioception miscommunications. Again, the brain has just become a little bit disoriented in where it is in time and space. And we see these drifts, we see the variability, we see the asymmetries. Um, um, because of this, again, here down at the end, this is obviously going to be increased risk of injury because we're not our postural responses to gravity and where we are and the environment is not adequate. Um, and we're not getting that sensory motor feedback. That's a common theme, I think, that we're seeing through all of these fatigue athletes. Um, if we look at the stride, you can see the stride, and this is actually one of the better ones that we've seen in the two webinars. The stride here is very, very symmetric, not a lot of variability. Stride nice, tight. They all look really good. And you can see here, bang, after not sleeping, it's all over the place. As we get again towards the end down here to the 1.2, 1.3 second, it's it's a bowl of spaghetti. There's a whole lot of stuff going on. We've lost the stride to stride consistency. We're having a degraded motor response. The rhythm is inefficient. We're having delayed recovery, as we can see with this lack of response coming up. It's taking a lot longer to get to that point. As we move from I don't know, I keep forgetting, maybe you guys can't see my pointer, but from the 0.8 to the 1 point second, where we're seeing that reduced rhythm efficiency and our loading mechanics are messed up. So what we're really seeing here is a really neuromuscular fatigue, neuromechanical fatigue issue from lack of sleep. And you can think about that and put this individual into practice the next day. May look great, may feel good, but there's some warning signs here that if I don't act preventively, I may be setting this up because you all, and unfortunately, probably all of us who have trained in the clinical world have had to go significant amounts of time without sleep. And I always say, yeah, I can go 24 hours without sleep. And if I do it on a Saturday, Sunday is going to be bad. It's going to be Monday and Tuesday are going to be bad. So if this guy goes to sleep, this athlete goes to sleep, sleeps really well that next night, this pattern is going to linger for 2 or 3 days. And we have to stay on top of that because it isn't just going to disappear with rest. So if we take that summary of everything we saw here in this individual, just in terms of their gait, we have loss of power. We saw the just absolute pooping out at the very end. We have disrupted gait repeatability, the step-to-step control. We have a breakdown in bilateral control and trunk movement. We have a lot of that sort of sway in our balance. That's telling me we don't have a whole lot of proprioceptive integration going on with what we're doing. So the idea is that we got to get this person into some recovery situation so that further down the week, this doesn't snowball into a really major problem. Baselines on this individual for stride, again, below baseline, still within sort of that average. And we were operating, this is a baseline before we really started doing anything. This baseline, the scores, as we were building up to, this is from the sleep deprivation, but before then we're way above baseline in a lot of these. So even though I'm still an average, I'm below baseline. It's nice to see that we have a drop below baseline because I know I have a problem, but I also have a really big change for this particular athlete, even though we're still in the T scores of 56, 55, 56, 56. Double leg stance, 57. We're still a little bit above baseline there, but we were much higher on some of our previous SportGait exams. So that little bit of change, dropping from like a 60 to a 57, is a lot to me. So if you look at what we talked about with our graphs, those are pretty dramatic looking changes in those graphs. We're only talking about a couple of percentages of T-scores here. So we have to be very, very aware of what's going on. And if we think of our power graph was, I think, the more interesting one. We had obviously some striking force issues at the end because we stopped. We just quit. Pushing force was above baseline, but within the average at the 50, but still had dropped from this particular athlete. Same with forward power. We were above baseline, but we had dropped for this particular athlete down to 52. Vertical power was still way above baseline. Look at where we were with vertical power, particularly because of where we were dealing with that left ACL issue. that we've dropped significantly from where we were on vertical power, because we were really working on that particular component with a lot of plyometric kind of stuff. We dropped to a 57, which is still in the T score. Still, we saw what happened in the tracing with that vertical power. Um, and side power, we dropped below baseline and we were way above baseline when we started. So the T scores and the things, the bars are helpful information for us sometimes, but we also have to dive into what's going on step to step. And the biggest thing to look for when you're athletes is change. Is there change? And it may be very tempting to say, well, he's on baseline here, vertical power, he'll get better with some sleep. But that misses a huge part of the story of what's going on. CPT, the CPT was subtle but yet interesting. We had most of the scores went up from where we were. Um, um, where are some of the biggest ones here? Hit reaction time, ISS changed 49 to 58, right? That tells me we're having, difficulty adapting to time changes and timing changes. So when you think about the amount of time that happens between each letter and the amount of time you have to strike it before it disappears, that person is not reacting to those stimuli very well. Our preservations went way up. So we're having repeated responses that are impulsive, that we don't have a lot of inhibition. We're just hitting, expecting the next letter to be a W, the next letter to be a T, the next letter to be an A, without really thinking. I have to watch for an X. We're not able to inhibit. Um, and the variability again points to us being unstable. So we did have some changes in the CPT that tell us this person is tired. Summarize the gait output of this particular athlete, rest versus sleep deprived. We've lost neuromuscular drive. We have motor timing disruption. We have trunk and lower limb compensation, particularly with that left leg just not doing what it's supposed to do even more now. Our left side is tired, really tired, and we're putting a lot of load onto our right side. Integrating that with a CPT shows a breakdown of focus, inhibition, and adaptation. And we're picking that up over the way that this person walks. It's showing itself as, and you can see the inhibition and breakdown in inhibition and adaptation, particularly in the power graph, and the stride graph, where everything's a little different. I'm starting to kind of lose my ability to control myself a little bit with that. So fatigue, cognitive fatigue, this person's body, I'm not worried about. I'm not worried about their physical fatigue. I'm not worried about it if we think about it in a classic sense. I'm not worried about them, in that regard. I'm worried about their brain because I know they just went, almost 36 hours without sleep sitting there. So I'm not worried about them being tired, but cognitive fatigue doesn't stay in the brain. It shows up everywhere. It shows up in your feet from the ground up. And, you know, it, sleep deprivation athletes just don't think slower. They move slower. They move less efficient. That's why sleep is such an important part of the recovery program with any team that you work with. And when this person, if you don't intervene with something here, a recovery protocol, 2, 3, 4 days down the road, you're really going to be at increased risk for an injury. We look at all three of these athletes put together. We're really talking about a couple of different patterns of fatigue. We're talking about someone who just late in the season and I'm just worried about physical and cognitive and emotional and everything that's going on in this athlete's life, and versus the non-compliant athlete that, decides a week off is a week off. And then another athlete who, due to life circumstances and things getting in the way, didn't sleep for almost, 36 hours. We see some commonalities in these things where we start to see really this posterior chain under recruitment. Whatever is going on in the brain is, a lot of that comes from the lack of proprioceptive responses or integration with what we're having from this vestibular impulse with the proprioceptive impulses coming from joints. That translates into itself into a lot of trunk issues, glute and hamstring fatigues, because those are really kind of our anti-gravity muscles. And when we lose proprioceptive information, vestibular information, we have a really hard time dealing with gravity. So we're going to start shifting load onto our dominant side. So we have the discoordination where the dominant side is doing a lot more work. The non-dominant side is doing a lot less work, operating a lot less efficiently, which also puts that at risk for injury. We're having poor adaptation to changing demands. So that puts you at risk when you're on the field or in the court or anywhere where you have to make quick decisions. cutting, bounding, um, reacting to a ball, reacting to a play. You're going to have poor adaptation. You're going to be unstable. You're going to have reduced mental pacing. So you're going to be paying attention for some period of that time and then not paying attention for that period of time. And your body can't hold that rhythm for that or lack of rhythm for very long, and something is going to break. Um, so again, why this deep, we saw this slide being why this deep dive matters. I hope you understand right now, and after going through those cases, that everybody, it's a job of an athlete to work hard, and athletes are always tired. And how they get tired and why they get tired usually leads back to something going on in the brain, and it's measurable. We can intervene. Some of these athletes would have been left to their own devices and been like, "You're good to go." No way to predict whether or not they ever would have had an injury, but I show an increased risk. And if I see an increased risk and I can do something about it, I think it's my responsibility to be able to do something about it. So we all know they're tired. So it's not about identifying. This is probably, I buried the headline of this whole talk here. It's not identifying fatigue. We know they're tired. It's decoding it and understanding what systems are involved and how we're decompensating with fatigue and how we can help set up a program, a prehab program to keep them moving. Which brings me to my towards the end of the talk here is that taking a day off doesn't fix things. Rest is not recovery, especially in high performing athletes. A lighter day is not going to reverse the CNS effects. I'm sorry. Asymmetry and motor drift don't reset with rest alone. Like we saw with people who don't sleep, that can last 2 to 3 days. The cognitive motor coupling stays altered even if we don't do something to fix it. So you don't fix fatigue by removing movement or removing load. You fix it by restoring function. And that's why we treat the system and not worry about the schedule. There's no days off, you get time off. And one of the things that we will focus on, particularly with our athletes at TBRX, is in these particular cases, number one thing I'm thinking is sleep quality. How can we improve your sleep? What do we need to do? I'm not saying go home and take a nap. How do we deal with your sleep? Neuromotor fatigue. What are we going to do? We're going to see that you have imbalances. You're overworking your right leg. You're underworking your left leg. Your glutes are not activating. Your core is unstable. You're having forward or backwards drift. I'm going to design a pre-workout 5 to 10 minute little routine that's going to activate those parts that aren't working. And it's that active recovery. You've heard those words, active recovery, that are going to get those muscles to kind of wake up and do their job. I'm going to activate the glutes. I'm going to activate the core. I'm going to activate that left leg to get it to do more stuff. We're also going to focus a lot on hydration and nutrition. That's how fatigue is one of a huge generator of inflammation. When you're tired, you have increased inflammatory markers. You have increased inflammation. So we're going to try to dampen inflammation and decrease any sort of oxidative stress stuff that's going on with anybody, with brain fog symptoms by using, increased nutrition or use a lot of omega-3s. Cold exposure sometimes. Some people are a big supporter of that. Some people are not. Mitochondrial support, again, getting energy systems in here, making sure our diet's great, our water's great. We're giving them electrolytes. And I'll actually give them some things to help them sleep. But we're also going to put some cognitive load onto it. As we're doing our prehab workouts, we're going to do some cognitive testing. We're going to do ball tracking. We're going to do some things that are going to try to wake that brain up a little bit to help that system recover itself. So when you see fatigue, it doesn't mean stop and do nothing. It means we just got to take a shift on what we can do. How precise can we be on what we're doing with our athletes to prevent them from ending up in a training room and in a situation where they're going to be hurt. And I think over time now, because we started a little late and we run a little late, but this is our pillars that I've worked, for 30 years of just looking at hydration, nutrition. Again, we talked about movement. That's functional movement. What kind of functional movements can I put into before practice or before workout to wake up some of these systems to make sure that they're activated. And mental fitness, thinking about mindsets, soft tissue work, again, nutrition, staying hydrated, trying to cut down on pro-inflammatory foods, increasing whole foods, eating the rainbow, really supporting these fatigued athletes with things that we can control. I'm avoiding alcohol, sugar, processed meats, fried foods, fast foods. Um, the number one thing, I say number one, number two thing is going to be hydration. We're going to get them to drink a lot of water and stay hydrated because you find that when people are fatigued or in situations of fatigue, whether it's life circumstance or not, they're probably going to be dehydrated as a compensatory measure. Sleep, that's the first thing we're going to go for with these athletes is we're going to do a deep dive into their sleep hygiene. Um, and then mindset is really important. Um, getting people who are tired are emotionally tired, they're cognitively tired, the reserves are low. So making sure we have the great mindset. We always want to try to be positive. We always want to try to be, hey, this is where we are right now. We're going to be better tomorrow. We're going to work on this, and giving them some idea that they're not just left to their own devices. They have a support system. They have someone who's there to help them. They have someone who has an interest on keeping them healthy and keeping them moving. Being tired can be a very difficult thing to deal with, particularly late in the season. How do we stay sharp mentally? How do we stay sharp emotionally? Um, Having these conversations and building relationships with your athletes. I find that SportGate is a really great conduit for that because they know that I'm paying attention to them. They know that I care about them. And we're going to have these conversations about, there's moments where, I just don't know if I can do this week. Well, let's get through today. How about we just get through what we need to do this morning and we'll talk about, just ways how you can help set uh, mindsets. With that, I'll stop. And I'm not sure, Beth, if we have questions or what. That was a lot of stuff. We started late, so I'm not sure who's still with us.
There's still a few with us. No questions have come through the chat just yet, but if anybody does have a question, I'm monitoring it right now. Please feel free to type in a question and we'll hopefully get answered. If not, next week again, noon, we promise we'll have all the glitches kind of worked out so there won't be any more technical difficulties. Fingers crossed, Zoom doesn't kick me out again. But thank you again. If there's any questions, I'll monitor it for the next few minutes and see if Pete can answer anything for you.
Yeah, hopefully we'll get some questions. A lot of information. Again, the idea that you have this amazing tool in your pocket, um, that you can take out and use at any point in time, and you just see, somebody sitting around in the facility doing nothing or looking at their phone. Hey, let's do a sport gate, see where you are today. And having that comparative data and knowing when things change in athletes and knowing your athletes, um, and knowing that, I know this athlete really well and it just doesn't seem like, his or herself today. Let's take a sport gate. It's my answer for everything. Well, let's do a sport gate. We can fix everything. So, I think the idea is to try to use it more and more in what you do, and you'll find that the more you use it, the more information you can find, and the more valuable you can be to your athletes and to your team. You can become a real asset.
We do have one question from James Bridget. How can you address diet on a budget?
Um, that's really, really great question. Um, and there's a spectrum to that, and obviously in the professional world, people eat at the facilities, and then you have high school athletes. I deal with a lot of high school athletes, and you know, diet can be a real challenge. And if I always try to put it in the mindset um, of moderation, and eating healthily is not much more expensive than fast food. So dealing with nutrition on a budget can be as simple as uh, um, you know finding the specials on. I remember going being a poor college kid and finding where's the cheapest chicken, what's the cheapest chicken, what's the where's the and we get the bulk rice, or trying to find the best options for you. And it's not always going to be perfect, but you can make it better. And thinking about diet on a budget is thinking about what are the things that are good for you, what are the things that are not good for me. And it comes down to things like making decisions around processed foods. It's really easy to go and get TV dinners or whatever you want to call them now, or pre-cooked meals and just nuke them. It's convenient and we're tired. There are better ones and not better ones. Um, we can And if it's a real issue, as I live in a very rural area, and so you see a lot of challenges, particularly with the youth and young athletes on trying to hit that sweet point, is just doing the best you can. Um, if you're in a situation no, where nobody expects anybody to be perfect, is can I make a better decision? If I'm faced with two options, is there a better or a worse one? Um, Making those sort of things and taking advantage of resources that may be around you. For our community, maybe our school often provides breakfast, and getting some of our athletes that I know have challenges to, let's get to school for breakfast. Make sure that it's cafeteria food. It's not the best food in the world, but it's free and it isn't nothing. So it kind of depends on your circumstance, and it's always a balance of just trying to do the best decision that you have in front of you with what resources that you have. If you're dealing with a team on a budget, it's a very different thing. And then you have, people and resources that you can deal with at the school or in larger circumstances. But individually, it's just doing the best you can and not beating yourself up over it. Um, is Be kind to yourself, I guess.
Pete, we have another question that has come in.
Yes.
Aside from normal gait strike patterns during the assessment, do you slash can we add different strike patterns? For example, toe in, toe out. And can we
Mm.
tease out impairment of those through the interface?
That's a really, really good question. And what I have found is I found, a lot of externally rotated feet because we have weak adductors, overactivated external rotators in their hips. So we might not see the actual, if I don't know if it makes it in my hands, if one foot's walking this way and I have a hamstring and, my hip, because one thing that happens with hamstring injuries is that, sometimes your glutes and external rotators and your um, gemelli and those other muscles are going to take over and rotate your hip. And you have one foot, let's say one foot looks like this. That's not going to show up necessarily as a footstep pattern, but we'll see imbalances, because I'm going to have more stability on this foot than I'm going to have on this foot. I'm probably going to spend less time on this foot than I am on this foot. So we may see different times of double leg stance, slowing of single leg stance on this side. We'll see decreased power on this side. So it'll show us patterns such as that you will interpret as something's going on. Say this is my left hand, and so let's say that we have a problem with the left leg where we're not having a lot of power. The stride is shortened. We're having some increased sway that way because I'm not stable, and that will show up in some of those tracings as those sort of patterns. And striking force, particularly push off force, is going to be decreased. So, you might not detect those exactly, but you'll be able to see there's an alteration here. And then if you actually go watch somebody walk and you can see them, then you know why. You'll see, oh, the glutes aren't activating. I need to get my hamstrings back engaged. The calf isn't pushing off. And so we can do it in that sort of way. But in terms of the foot pattern, not really, but it will show up in the waveforms of our gait cycles. I hope that answered.
Amazing. That's it on the questions, Pete.
That's it.
That's it as of now.
Either no one was listening or that was a really good talk. I'm not sure. I always get worried with no questions.
Well, wonderful. Well, that'll wrap today's session. Again, we'll be back next week at noon Eastern Standard Time for another session. This was recorded, so we'll be sharing that on our YouTube channel as well. It also stays on our LinkedIn under our events tab. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Bye.